Hello and welcome to Unacademy, the one-stop solution for an English medium UPSC Civil Services aspirant. As part of your comprehensive news analysis today, we'll be discussing 7 very important articles out of the Hindu newspaper. But before we begin, as always, 4 very important announcements for you, 2 very critical for your preparation generally. Firstly, we are running a very important program under which we're offering the Unacademy course at a discounted price of 29,999. And if you have ever considered becoming a part of Unacademy, this would be the right time. A 15 months course at 29,999. You can call this number if you are interested. Over and above that, we have a very important workshop by Sarmad Sir himself, who will be talking about what to do after class 12th and should you consider IAS and IPS as a career option. So he'll be live on Sunday on 26th at 11 a.m. in the morning. This is a live workshop. You can interact with him and you can register via the link given in the description box. All the links are given in the description box. And for all the students who had a certain issue with regards to getting the PDFs, please do understand that the PDF will be available on the Telegram channel, for which again the link of the Telegram channel is given in the description box. So all the Conquer Prelims PDFs and all the PDFs of the CNA will be pushed into the Telegram channel so that there is no issue. We got to know that there was a certain issue with regards to that, and we are now getting that resolved, and you should just be able to do it through the Telegram channel. So do just go and join our Telegram channel. With this, 2 very important announcements. First, we have the special class of Hima Bindu ma'am, where she's taking the science and technology questions related to statics. She'll be very soon entering the second phase also. And science and technology, 6 p.m, very important. She's taking all static portions, revising static portions through questions. At the same time, we have the much awaited marathon session of environment and ecology, which is going to be on 22nd May at 7:30, which is today. We have 2 sessions, one on the app itself, and it is science and technology, the 6th class. And over and above that, the marathon of environment and ecology is going to happen at 7:30 today with Mukesh sir. I hope you are extremely excited about this and you are ready to become a part of this as soon as possible. So don't miss this session. And Conquer Prelims session marathon PDF will be pushed into the Telegram channel. So don't have to worry about the PDF in that regard. Okay. So with this, let's start our analysis. So we have to cover 7 topics. And the first one is going to be a very interesting one related to carbon footprints and local footprints. Over and above that, we'll be talking about RBI's proposed change in the framework related to financing. Then we will talk about climate change and electoral politics. There's a lot of conversation with regards to this. Then we have also Russia and its positioning, and a very interesting article about how it is using nuclear deterrence today. Further, we'll be talking about the GDP projections for this year and Karnataka, a new reservation law which has come in for outsourced jobs itself. And last but not the least, we will talk about CDS talking about what is called as jointness 1.0 and jointness 2.0. We'll discuss these 2 things in that regard. So with this, let's enter our first discussion. Don't forget, Conquer Prelims Phase 1 and Conquer Prelims Phase 2, both are now available. The PDFs are available on the Telegram channel. So don't forget that in that regard. So let's discuss the first topic, which is analyzing local environmental footprints. Now, this is a very interesting topic. Why is it interesting? Is because it talks about a very fundamental concept of carbon footprints, but at a local level rather than a country level, or for example, a supranational level. This is a very interesting article because it has analyzed something which generally is considered very interesting. And more than that, they have analyzed it in the context of income levels and how it is divided according to income levels. Meaning that they're arguing that if we are analyzing carbon footprints at the supranational or at the national level itself, we don't get the right picture, and that may be true for India properly. So first things first, we have to understand, what do you mean by a carbon footprint? What does carbon generally Carbon footprint is basically, it can be taken at an individual level, it can be taken at a community level, it can be taken at a national level. Now, when we're talking about at the individual, national or community level, it is about how much carbon is emitted in the form of carbon dioxide, or it's what we call as different elements in consuming goods and services. So, for example, electricity, transport, recycling, gas, personal use, fuel, water, emissions, everything is taken into account. So, the carbon footprint is basically the footprint of an individual. It can be per capita, it can be at the national level, it can be for a certain region also, but we take it at individual level, we take it at community level mostly, and we take it at the national level. Now, when we talk about individual, community, and national, specifically carbon footprints, we generally are trying to understand how much carbon emissions we are doing. Now, for a country like India, which is a developing country, we have a very big load of what we call as carbon emission. So, we are emitting maybe more than most of the countries of the European sector, and India and China, being in the developing phase, are emitting more carbon, but per capita carbon emission or the carbon footprint of every individual Indian is much, much lower, 3 times lower than the emission of a person who is sitting, for example, in the USA. The US has a smaller population, but their carbon footprint is extremely big because every individual is emitting more than what an Indian is generally. This is basically because of different levels of development and different levels of technology. More than that, it's about how there is an income distribution in the country itself. So carbon footprint, this is the first point you need to know, is related to the concept of what is the emissions which happen at an individual, community, or a national level. And carbon footprints are the way, it's a value which is used to decide and understand per capita or national emissions, which basically tell you how polluting that population is. To be very blunt and to be very simplistic, it is about how polluting that population is. This is the concept of carbon footprint. Now, there is a certain study which has recently happened, and the author is part of that also. And that study is water, air pollution, and carbon footprints of conspicuous luxury consumption in India. Now, this is a very interesting thing. What it does is it divides India according to income groups. It divides India according to income groups. And when you go into income groups, it basically takes the richest or the wealthiest and the poorer section of the society, and it tries to understand that this strata of the society, the richest strata of the society, the affluent individuals, do they have a differential impact on environment, or the carbon footprint of these individuals and these individuals, how much there is a differentiation? Is there a substantial difference between the poor and the richest? And vis-a-vis that, is there a major differentiation between their footprint? And if yes, then what are the indicators for that? And what are the spaces in which that is happening? This is a very important point you need to understand. So, when we talk about water, air, and carbon footprint, it is talking about luxury, which is, it is talking about conspicuous position. If you have basic needs, if you need a certain basket of basic needs, if you are meeting that, you are doing sustainable and subsistence existence, which is you need, for example, 2,800 calories, you need 2,400 calories, you are meeting that, that is basic consumption. Conspicuous consumption means that when you are consuming for show, for luxury, and this is a very important point you need to understand, luxury production, conspicuous production is basically the concept of consuming for show off, which in India is now becoming a major problem. If you need, for example, for one person, you need a small car, a hatchback, you are buying an SUV because you want to show off. that is where luxury production or luxury idea comes in, that you are showing off through consumption itself. So what this article is trying to understand is that when you are trying to do that, which is when you're trying to show off, and when this upper strata, the 10% or the upper 1% of the population, if they are doing this form of luxury product, luxury consumption, conscriptive consumption, which is basically consuming for just show off, does it have a bigger impact on the carbon footprint, or what is the quantum of difference in carbon footprint? This is a very interesting point you need to understand. It is not just talking about the nation, it is talking about the local and regional. And this is one of the points which this article makes, which is that when it comes to the concept of carbon footprints, it never makes sense to understand it at the level of nations. It should be understood at the level of what we today understand and perceive as local and regional. It is only when you understand local and regional that you actually understand the concept of carbon footprint in the right context. The right context only comes in when you are understanding at an individual, at a local, at a regional level. This is a very important point you need to understand, which this article is pointing out throughout this whole discussion, which is local and regional is more important than just the concept of the national community. And this is where individual consumption really matters. And we need to understand that, we need to study it in the right context also. So first, I have basically spelled out the parameters for you, which is that it is talking about carbon footprint. It is talking about individual carbon footprint. It is also talking about water, air, and carbon footprint, specifically related to consumption, which is beyond individuals, beyond just individuals. They're taking into account the income of that individual, and they're taking into account the carbon footprint of luxury items and luxury individuals. This is a very important point you need to understand, wherein the consumption of the individual is not just important, it is the bracket in which he is there. Now, the next point which the article points out and is able to ascertain is that what parameters should we take into account? If we have to take into account, for example, air pollution, water pollution, and we have to take into account emissions, there are two ways of doing it. First, it takes into account carbon dioxide emission, water consumption, and PM 2.5. For India, these three would be very good indicators, because PM 2.5, water, and CO2 are three very standard things which impact Indians on the day-to-day basis, with air pollution, water pollution, and particulate pollution. Within air pollution, this impacts all of us. So CO2, water, and PM 2.5 are three indicators which it takes into account. Now, when the basket is created for the affluent individuals, what is important is dining out, vacations, furniture, social events. All of these things are taken into consideration. What do I mean by that? Meaning that if there is a certain basket of basic needs, what we call as conspicuous consumption, which is consumption over and above basic needs, they are taking into account vacations, furniture, social events, dining out, meaning things which generally are considered luxury. So we have CO2, water, and PM 2.5 as indicators. Over and above that, we have vacations, furniture, social events, and dining out, and other indicators of consumption beyond basic needs itself. But there are two ways of further categorizing carbon emissions, and that is when you take into account what is called as embedded emission, and this is very important for you, what is called as embedded emission and direct emission. What do you mean by embedded emission and direct emission? So what they are taking into account is CO2, water, and PM 2.5. But within that, they are also taking into account the aspect of embedded and direct. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is, see, when you consume something, there can be a direct emission, but there can be an embedded cost of that also. What do you mean by that? For example, you are buying an SUV. Now, obviously, it is directly emitting quite a lot. Direct emission is extremely high, extremely high. However, when that SUV was produced is also when there's an embedded cost. There's an embedded cost also, and there is a direct emission also. What I mean by that is that if you are using the SUV on day-to-day basis, there's a certain emission which is coming in. And when we talk about the emission which is happening not just from direct, when that SUV was produced, more steel was used, more of the parts were used, more rubber was used, more leather was used, and therefore embedded cost increases. Embedded cost increases. So when we talk about costs, we have direct cost or direct emissions, and we have embedded emissions. So direct emission, embedded emission is something which is quite important for us to understand. The same way, for example, you use a luxury item. When you use that luxury item, you are generally having a bigger carbon footprint, but at the same point of time, you also have an embedded carbon footprint which is actually higher. So it does not just take into account PM 2.5 for just as the concept of what we call as CO2, water, particulate matter, but it also takes into account the embedded and direct emissions in that regard. Now, I can see that I know you cannot chat with us, but I can see that there's a certain modulation. I'll just get it checked that if that is true or not. I can see that it's a little bit, I have the preview there. So I can see that there's a little bit of modulation. Give me 1 second and we'll get this sorted. Yeah, give me 1 second. Okay. Okay, it should be now fine. Generally, I could see that there were a little bit of frame drop, but I think we have sorted that out. It's just the YouTube server modulating more than anything. It is not an internet issue. It is the YouTube server. Okay. So, as I was saying, let me repeat what we've done till this point. Very simply, we've understood what are the parameters of this whole article itself, which is the concept of carbon footprint. When we talk about carbon footprint itself, we were not discussing at the national level or the community level. We were discussing it at the individual level itself. And when we're talking about individual level, it divides the Indian population into stratas. And when it is dividing into stratas, we have the richest and the poorest. And we are now trying to understand how is their consumption relating to carbon footprint, and does luxury consumption actually lead to more carbon emissions or carbon footprint. And three considerations or parameters we're taking into consideration. You have CO2, water, and PM 2.5, which is carbon dioxide, water, and particulate matter. At the same point of time, they took luxury consumption with regards to furniture or, for example, vacations or dining out. And the PM 2.5 footprint is also taking into account not just direct, but also embedded, which is if there is more emission to produce that item, that is also taken into account. Now, what is the conclusion which comes through? when we take all of this into consideration, which is embedded emissions, when we take direct emissions, over and above that, if we take both of them together, we have the further concept of CO2, water, and PM 2.5. And if we take all of this under consideration, we have the concept of carbon footprint, and we have a certain conclusion. This conclusion is important because that generally allows us to come to a very important realization that carbon footprint analysis makes no sense at the level of the supra, which is at the national level, but it actually is at the local and the regional level where it really matters, So when we talk about the findings of this study itself, we have that the richest have 10% of the households approximately are emitting double the average population. This is a very interesting concept itself, that 20% of what we call as the population, the upper strata, within that 10%, this 10% is having an emission which is double the standard average emission of the population itself. This is a very interesting concept in that regard, because this is the first time we have tangible data driven finding where we can argue that the footprint is much higher for the richest rather than the poorest. This is a very important point you need to understand in the larger context, which is carbon footprint when it comes to air pollution is 68% higher. When it comes to water footprint, it is 39% higher. And for CO2 emissions, it is 55% higher. So when we talk about the footprints itself, 10% higher, 10% of the population has double the emission itself, and further 68%, 39%, and 55% is the emissions, which is basically higher than what it would have been for an average person. Now, when we talk about this, it also gives us a certain understanding about the wealthiest. Within this 10%, 5% and 5%, if you go into, the lower 5% within this 10% are still in the takeoff stage, which is that they're just consuming to show off. They have not become properly wealthy. They're just consuming to show off. On the other hand, the upper 5% are actually wealthy in that regard. So our wealthy population is also not technically properly wealthy. It is not technically properly wealthy because they're still in that phase of taking off, wherein there will be a takeoff stage of what they call as properly wealthy and not being properly wealthy. This is where the analysis becomes even more interesting because it gives you a totally new understanding of the whole concept itself. Right. Okay. Now, so the first conclusion which comes out is a very interesting one. See, it says 10% of the population has double the emissions, and at the same point of time, these double the emissions. If we go by that, in CO2, in air pollution, and in water, it is in particulate matter 2.5 that the highest emission is there. Further, in CO2 and water, there is less, but the number is substantially higher. So for this, we got the data of 68%, 39%, and 55%. But what is even more interesting is that within this 10%, the upper 5% are actually wealthy, and within that, the lower 5% are at the takeoff stage where they've actually not properly become wealthy itself. Which is the idea which you need to understand is that this double the emissions which we talk about 5% and 5%. The whole concept is very, very simple, which is that the certain population has taken off, certain population hasn't taken off in that regard. Okay. So the first conclusion which we can come to through the first discussion we had with regards to analyzing local environmental footprints is very simple, that when we talk about carbon footprints, I'm again repeating myself so that you understand it in the right way. We have not taken national, community or individual into consideration. What we've taken into consideration is individual, but within individual we've taken into consideration the different stratas. And based on income understanding, richest and poor in different ideas and in different spaces itself. Further, what are the parameters we have taken into account? We have taken into account CO2, water and PM 2.5 as the most important parameter. Now, over and above that, we are taking dining out, vacations, furniture and social events as indicators of consumption, and PM 2.5 and water or be it CO2 emissions, we are taking into account both direct and embedded in that sense. Now, what we need to understand is what is the basic conclusion. The basic conclusion which comes through is that richest 10% are doubling the carbon footprint. Over and above that, 68% in air pollution, 39% in water, and in CO2 55%. Further, what we further analyze is that within this, the upper 5% are actually wealthy. They are actually doing things which are done by same counterparts in America or in Europe. But the lower 5% in this is actually in the takeoff stage. Takeoff stage means that they are still consuming to show that they are wealthy. To show that they are wealthy, but they aren't wealthy. They're actually not wealthy. They're not actually wealthy, but they're showing that they're wealthy. And therein, this is a very interesting concept itself. Now, what are the key contributors to this differentiation, to this disparity in that regard? The key differentiation in this disparity is the fact that the upper 5%, upper 10% in that regard are eating out more. So the food consumption, there's a much higher, much higher carbon emission for the food they eat, because they will take a car, then go to the restaurant. The restaurant has an AC which is running the whole day itself. Then, for example, for producing the same food, there will be more use of fuel itself. So food and restaurant eating increases the carbon footprint generally. And this is a very interesting point you need to understand, because this in turn leads us to say that food made at home has a lower carbon footprint than food made or eaten out in a restaurant. Further, we have, for example, consumption of fruits and nuts. When we talk about fruits and nuts within this organic space, what we call about, fruits and nuts produced locally have a lower carbon footprint than fruits and nuts which are produced at a supranational level itself. And therefore, we have imported fruits, imported nuts, then again, the carbon footprint is much higher, because the fruits and the nuts which are getting imported or are coming from certain specific areas which are luxury consumption, this in turn means that there is a higher water consumption for them, higher what we call as carbon dioxide emission for them, and therefore it makes it very simple that the concept of eating, what you are eating, from where it is coming, is equally important. Further, we have personal goods, jewelry and eating out being in the upper and the lower is a very major contributor. This is a very important point you need to understand, that a major contributor of all of this is actually eating out. Food eaten out has a major impact on the carbon footprint of a person. And for the lower strata, what is the biggest contributor to the footprint is using traditional firewood and traditional fuel in that regard. The people who are using traditional fuel and firewood, they basically are having generically a problem with regards to their footprint being higher. But for them, that is the least of their concerns, because it is more about the doubling of that footprint than just the fuel or the traditional organic fuel cost as we know about it. Now, what are the implications of this? So let us close this topic by understanding what it really understands and means. See, carbon footprint can be taken into consideration with regards to both individual, at a community level, at a level of what we call as nation. But neither nation is taken into consideration, neither community is taken into consideration. According to the article, what should be taken into consideration is local plus regional, and local consumption, within which what is the basic needs and what are the luxury. Now, the conclusion which this article comes to is a very simple and straightforward one, which is that carbon emissions in the form of CO2, water and air pollution in the form of PM 2.5, all of them are much higher for a person who is doing luxury consumption than just doing basic consumption or basic needs in that regard. Herein, there's a doubling, and any policy decision, any policy making should take into account this concept, wherein you have carbon emission, you have water and you have air. You have to take into consideration that it is not just that a one size fits all umbrella term or umbrella policy would actually make sense. It has to be much higher than that. It has to be much more in depth and nuanced, because we have to understand how the local is consuming rather than how the nation is consuming. Because if we are putting in what we call as very broad policies itself, it will never work. What you need to take into consideration is not just broad, but local, regional, small. This is a very important point you need to understand, wherein the concept of basics or basic need and local is very interesting and important. If you don't understand this, then the policy will always target the wrong population, and we need to change that in that regard. So, what do we understand till this point? We understand that carbon footprint at the individual level should be taken into consideration. Further, carbon emission, water and air should be taken into consideration at local, regional level, and conspicuous consumption, which is consumption beyond the needs itself, is something which is a bigger problem than just having carbon emissions at the national level or dividing all the carbon emission by the population, because that will never give you a holistic picture. That will never give you a holistic picture. With this, let's move to the second topic. The second topic is equally interesting and important. Okay, just give me 1 second. Right. When we talk about the second topic, it is equally interesting because it is RBI's solution to a problem. And when we talk about RBI's solution to a problem, it is basically talking about project financing and how project financing in India has become a major problem. There are 4 issues which this article points out, and over and above that, it also points out how these 4 issues are related to the concept of what we call today as the banks not trying to fund infrastructure projects or very big projects, and generally they are not ready to fund these very big, very standard, the very in non-commercial but essential infrastructure in that regard, because there's always a delay and there are multiple roadblocks which it has to go through in that sense. Now, when we talk about RBI, here there is the consideration with regards to long gestation period, that all these projects have a very long gestation period. Further, they have a basic roadblock when it comes to permissions, and most of them run over time or over budget. This is a very important point you need to understand. It is mostly over time or over budget. This always happens, wherein the infrastructure projects, non-infrastructure projects, commercial real estate sector generally sees a major problem when it comes to the concept of regulatory framework or when it comes to funding. This is a very standard concept which is there, and there needs to be a certain regulatory framework by the RBI which undercuts this, because these infrastructure projects are important. So therefore, it needs to be undercut, and that undercutting can only be done if there's a proper RBI framework or draft regulations have been pushed in. So these are draft regulations in which it is trying to remove the roadblocks from infrastructure, non-infrastructure and commercial real estate projects itself, and trying to create a certain space in which these can be funded in the larger context. Now, the first core issue which is pointed out is the fact that you have long gestation period and high probability of being fiscally non-viable, and you have also the project getting loans, but there will be a lot of delay in that regard. So this is a very important concept. Okay, I can see that there is again modulation. Give me 1 second. Okay, we are trying to get this resolved. This is not an internet issue. It's a server, YouTube server issue. But I'll try to get it sorted. I can see that you can't say it to me, but I can see it in the preview there. So what we were talking about was the concept of gestation periods and infrastructure. So the premise of this whole article itself is that the RBI has come up with a regulatory framework, a draft regulatory framework, under which it is basically trying to remove the roadblocks from the concept of what we today call as infrastructure projects, which are quite big, infrastructure projects which are generally quite significant in that sense. And therefore, when we talk about these very big infrastructure projects, there is issue of, for example, long gestation period infrastructure. There is a lot of loan or loan delays itself, or the duration itself of this loan is increased, or the amount is increased in that sense. And therefore, when we talk about these long durations or delays generally, it discourages everybody from doing something. I can see it is happening again. I'll get back to you in 1 second. Okay. So I think it should be sorted now. We have long gestation periods. We have the problem of long tenure of loans, and these loans get extended. Further, we have the issue which the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation has also pointed out, that from 1800 such projects, 779 have been delayed and 449 have cost overruns. So what this means basically is that when it comes to big infrastructure projects, when it comes to these mega projects which are critical for the nation, there's a lot of hesitancy, there's a lot of lukewarm response from big banks in that regard. So when we talk about infrastructure projects which are critical, because they tend to run into delays or the project cost increases, the problem is that RBI is trying to resolve that. Now, what is RBI's solution? When we talk about RBI's solution, the first is that they have used a terminology, and that terminology is called credit event. They are trying to mitigate a certain event which is called a credit event. What do you mean by a credit event? A credit event is when you have a default on the payment, default in the whole sector, in the whole process itself, or there is an extension in the date of commencement of the commercial operations, DCCO. This DCCO is a very important terminology, that it was thought that it will go into commercial operation after 2 years, but it was not able to, and that has been pushed to 5 years. And therefore, the concept is that either there is dilution of the net present value, which is the value of the state itself, or the whole project itself is devalued in that regard, or there's an issue with regards to DCCO, or the concept of defaulting on the payment itself. This is where RBI is actually very, very concerned and very, very pinpointedly working. Now, when we talk about this, they have created a new solution. The solution is called provisioning. They have asked every builder or every project manager to have a certain corpus of to be provisioned in a phased manner, and 5% of the whole total amount of that project needs to be provisioned so that it could be pushed later if the project cost goes up. This is a very important point which RBI is saying, which is that RBI is arguing through this draft regulation that there's a need to create a corpus which basically is there in a phased manner. Money is infused, and then it is used for what we today call as provisioning, which is that it can basically mitigate the issues which are generally there in the later stages. The other solution which RBI has brought in is that there needs to be certain prerequisites. To even get the loan, to even have this whole project go forward, there is a prerequisite which needs to be there, wherein there needs to be environmental, regulatory and legal clearances or procedural concepts done even before the project goes into anything. Even before you go for the commercial establishment DCCO, you have to make sure that legal clearances are there, environmental clearances are there, and regulatory clearances are there. Further, the financial disbursement, which is the money, will only be disbursed when there's a stages of completion. So it will not be that upfront all the money will be given to the builder. Rather, we will push it in tranches. Further, what we see is that there is an issue of how do we evaluate? You can't ask the builder to evaluate in what stage it is. So therefore, the concept of independent engineers and architects will be hired by the bank to check if the stages of completion are in the right space itself. And last but not the least is that when you want a certain delay in payment, or you want to default on payment itself, you want to reconsider the loan itself, you want to restructure the loan itself, the concept is you cannot do it if it is exceeding 85% of the project cost itself. If it is exceeding 85% of the project cost, then it is a problematic, then it is a problem. And therefore, the RBI has come up with basically 4 solutions. First solution is having a provision of 5% of the total amount as a provision, as a way of safeguard in the whole system itself. Second, you have to all prerequisites should be in position, wherein you have to get all legal and basic clearances in position itself. Third, there will be independent evaluation. Fourth, you will only get money if you are going to complete certain stages. And fifth, which is equally important, is the concept of if you want to restructure the loan, you cannot do it if you're asking for 85% and above restructuring of that loan itself. This is a very interesting point. RBI is trying to remove the roadblock. Let us see if this goes into proper implementation. What is the final draft, final regulations which come in? This is draft and is open for comments in that. So the second article talks about how is RBI trying to make sure that these credit events, the provisioning and these big infrastructure projects do not go into limbo, and as it is, most of these projects are either delayed or are having cost overruns. And if this is going to be the case, we will never be able to push properly these whole big events, what we call as projects, and they are critical for nation building itself. With this, let's move to the third topic, which is a very interesting one, which is related to climate change and electoral politics. This article has been written with a very interesting understanding, and the author himself has a lot of interesting things to say about it. When we talk about, for example, climate change, what he's arguing is that in our electoral politics, if you look at the manifestos of the different parties itself, there's not a lot they talk about with regards to climate change, which is that most of them are very silent on climate change. Even if they have certain provisions, they're very, very lukewarm, or they're very, very diluted concept itself. Now, what this article argues is, which is that why do they do it? Why is that in electoral politics of India, there is no talk about the concept of climate change itself? And second, over and above that, if there is no concept of climate change, what are the implications and how do we go forward with regards to that? Now, herein, he gives us 4 very interesting concepts. This is all his understanding. This is the author's understanding, and this is the author's arguments in that regard, and we will stick to that. We have the first argument which he gives is that integrating climate change with political agenda would basically entail acknowledging that there has to be trade-off between rapid industrial growth and environmental sustainability, which means that if we go for climate change based ideas, then rapid industrialization will not happen, and therefore we have to trade off between rapid industrialization and sustainability, and therefore there is a certain tightrope which these political parties would have to work on. This they don't want to do because such acknowledgement would alienate powerful industrialist constituencies and disrupt the economic status quo, and the people who, or the entities which rely on heavy fossil fuel consumption and emissions would get alienated. So basically, the capitalist, the industrial sector would get a little bit more alienated, and this is a very big problem. This is a very big problem because this could then mean that their main constituency, the funding would also go out of consideration. They would have to, in a way, alienate to become sustainable. Further, what he argues is that a detailed climate action plan would also need a long-term approach rather than a short-term approach. And because the broader trend is go for short-term economic gains than long-term economic gains or environmental sustainability, they don't want to take this trade-off. And last but not the least is, it also requires tough decisions. Tough decisions cannot be talked about in the manifestos itself. For example, coal, taxes, carbon emission, enforcing stringent environmental regulations. And basically, the argument is very simple. The argument is that when we talk about politics and climate change, our own parties don't want to talk about climate change because that needs a long-term vision which they cannot project within the manifestos. It would have to, this would alienate a certain section of their constituency which is reliant on carbon emissions itself, and it also needs a little bit of a larger political will. And what he's saying is that if we allow our political parties to go into elections without talking about climate change under these four basic parameters as pointed out by him, then what happens is this creates a challenge for electoral politics in India and India generally. So what he's saying is that climate change should be part of the conversation with regards to what we today call as electoral politics, and electoral politics and climate policy, the bridge should basically be removed, and these two should come together. The civil society and you and me have to play a very important role in that, because if you and me will not give heed to the concept of what we call today as environmental policy as being critical for choosing a representative, then they will keep on doing this. So this article generally says that media and civil society and individuals have to play a very important role, and whatever be the consideration, be it alienation, be it the concept of climate change, be it the concept of detailed climate action plan, or be it not having political will or long-term vision, we need to make sure that we push our political parties in a certain direction, that they talk about this in the larger context. With this, let's move to the fourth very interesting article about Russia. And this is very interesting because of a certain trend which has emerged. There's something called brinkmanship. Brinkmanship means that you tend to say that you will do you want somebody to agree with you, and basically you coerce that person to agree with you by saying that I will do something dangerous, which is that if you do not do this, I will do something much bigger. And this is basically what Russia is doing as of right now. And this is what the article also points out. See, Macron has recently argued that the French troops will fight in Ukraine. And even David Cameron has said that the British are sending long-term surface-to-air missiles into Ukraine. This has been seen by Russia as a major problematic involvement of the NATO in this Russia-Ukraine conflict itself. And now Russia is threatening to have proper military exercises, nuclear military exercises next to the Ukrainian border itself. It had already said that it has sent a lot of nuclear weaponry to Belarus, and basically Russia is using this nuclear card a lot, which is we will use nuclear power, we will use nuclear this, nuclear that. There's a lot of conversation with regards to this. Now, when we talk about this concept itself, what will happen? What will happen is that the Russians are creating a precedence. The precedence is, it's called the tactics of brinkmanship or coercion. What they are trying to do is, Russia is trying to stop further allied or NATO involvement by saying that your involvement means that I will use nuclear weapons or nuclear power in the form of a deterrence. Here, deterrence, nuclear deterrence in the context of Cold War was that there will be mutual destruction, nobody should fight. But here, there's the whole totally different concept itself. Russia is making small instances also very big by saying that if you do this, we will do nuclear war. If you will do this, if Macron is going to send, if France is going to send troop, we will use nuclear warfare. If Britain is going to send surface-to-air missiles, we will use nuclear warfare. If America is going to send F-16s, we will use nuclear warfare. This is basically the threat of using something much bigger than what the proportion is. So just sending F-16s is not the context of using nuclear warfare, but Russia is doing that. It is basically trying to remove this interference by arguing that we need to prevent escalation by arguing that we will do something very big. Now, whilst it may be working for Russia, the problem is that the implication of this is that Russia is creating precedents for now everybody to say this. So we have conflict across the world itself. So there can be a case in which routinely threatening to use nuclear weaponry over small instances could lead to smaller nuclear armed nations also arguing that we can also argue that if you will not give us this piece of land, we will use nuclear power. Iran, North Korea being the biggest threat in that regard. North Korea can now ask for anything saying that we will launch a nuclear missile. Russia, what it is doing is in a way is creating precedents, a certain tradition wherein now you can threaten to use nuclear power for small instances, and that in itself actually is a problematic existence for everybody, being the neighbor or be it global politics or geopolitics. Because if everybody is going to threaten for nuclear power or nuclear use of weaponry, then that basically becomes a certain precedence, a certain understanding where nobody is going to take nuclear power seriously or nuclear threat seriously. And therefore, the implications is now Ukraine is saying that when you told us in Budapest, in the Budapest memorandum in 1990s, that Russia, UK and US will not use nuclear power, so Ukraine shut down its nuclear power project itself. Now it's saying, why did we do that? If Russia will always threaten us with nuclear power, if we were a nuclear power, then we would never have been threatened by Russia itself. We did not become a nuclear power because you promised to us that Russia will not use it. So then what is the point of it? So since 1990s, this whole Budapest memorandum is becoming useless, where everybody was convinced that everybody is going to disarm, but nobody is disarming and Russia is now threatening to use nuclear power. Further, you have Iran. Iran is now saying that it is going to reconsider its nuclear project. It is going to reconsider its nuclear program under the context of Israel. Further, you have North Korea now can easily voluntarily threaten either the US, either China, not China though, but either Japan or any of the allied NATO members, that if you don't agree with us, then we are going to use nuclear power. So basically the implication of something like this is that the threat of nuclear power as seen during the Cold War was a very big threat, which is the concept that something very big was going to happen, mutual destruction, that is what was going to happen. However, nuclear power has now not become the concept of what we today call as a deterrence. They are using it as a way of coercion. If you will not do it, I will do this. So this is where Russia is facing precedence for other countries, which is not good, and there needs to be a certain understanding which needs to understand, where Russia has to either stop this or NATO has to find a way to either neutralize this threat or basically remove the fear or not get coerced by Russia because of this threat itself. Wherein this is a very interesting article which talks about a certain angle of understanding. After this, we have three very small, simple, straightforward articles. First is the GDP projections which have come in, wherein with industry and services slowing down and even agriculture after a very long time showing contraction, our GDP growth is expected to be at 6.7% between January and March. However, overall, it was average 7.8%, which is actually quite good. So the real data is going to come on 31st of May. Let us see what is the exact data. But fourth quarter, we've seen contraction. Further, we have Karnataka going with its trend of regionalism and regional reservation. It is arguing, moving beyond that, it is arguing that any government contract which is given for outsourced tenders, which is the government of India also, state governments outsource a lot of activities. For example, they outsource drivers, they outsource a lot of what we call as maintenance men and women. Here, what the Karnataka government is saying, 33% reservation of women is going to be there. If you are putting out a tender for an outsourced job, you have to give 33% of that jobs to women itself. And therefore, this will only be for any job which is lasting more than 45 days and has more than 20 people. But this is a very interesting thing. The meaning within informality itself, they are trying to push in reservation, wherein 33% of women have to be there within an outsourced job. It is if it has more than 20 people and works more than 45 days. A very interesting development from Karnataka. Last but not the least is a very interesting thing which the CDS said, which is the concept of jointness. Jointness 2.0, jointness 1.0. He says that the only way India moves forward through its military tactic is that we initially had the concept of jointness, all three services coming together, but jointness 1.0 was based on the concept of consensus between the services on what to do. Now he's talking about jointness 2.0, which is the concept where joint culture is created, but not just through consensus, but now operationally there is also jointness, wherein the army, the navy, and the air force can operate together, and that is what he's argued recently in a lecture, that we need to make sure that jointness 2.0 now becomes the most important concept in the larger context of what we have done. So what have we done today? We've understood the concept of how local and regional carbon footprints are more important, and luxury consumption is doubling the carbon footprint. So therefore, it makes more sense to understand in what we call as income brackets itself. Second, we tried to understand the concept of Russia and its precedence on creating a nuclear threat over small issues itself. We also tried to understand how RBI has brought in a draft regulation to fund these very big infrastructure projects itself. And last but not the least, we've also understood that when we talk about the GDP itself, last 3 quarters, it has actually, last quarter itself, it has fallen. On the other hand, first 3 quarters were quite good in that sense. With this, let's look at the mains questions itself. First question, local and regional carbon footprints may be the answer to the climate change conundrum. This is where we can understand it in a more comprehensive manner. Discuss 150 words, GS paper 3. And you have Russia's brinkmanship and coercion via nuclear weapons creates a dangerous precedence. Elucidated. It's a very good question for GS paper 2. With this, I would like to end the session. Thank you so much for being here. I'll see you tomorrow, same time, with another set of 7 to 8 topics. Thank you. Take care.